I think that the international rules-based order, to the extent that there ever was such a thing, has basically bitten the dust.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Callum Price, Director of Communications here, and today I'm joined by Dr Stephen Davies, who is our Senior Education Fellow. Today we're going to talk about something a little bit different that we don't normally dive into on the IEA podcast, the world of foreign policy, and more importantly, what the classical liberal responses to current events in that realm should be. This week, things have all kicked off, as they say, over the pond, as America has had something to say, to put it mildly, about what's going on in Venezuela. And to talk us through all of that and what classical liberals should maybe think about it, Steve is here with us. So, Steve, could you start by just giving us a bit of an overview for those who've had their head in the sand, what's going on in Venezuela, what sort of background to it is?
Yeah. Well, I think unless you've been living under a rock, you must know that there was a US Special Forces operation which involved multiple airstrikes in Venezuela and the seizure and abduction of the president of Venezuela and his wife, who've now been taken to New York to stand trial on drugs charges. Now, the backdrop to this is that for some considerable time, the Trump administration has been blowing up small boats in the Caribbean heading out of Venezuela on the grounds, they say, that these are part of a drug smuggling operation. Whether this is true or not, we do not know because we've not been made privy to the information. The point about that, though, is that these strikes on small boats, which included in one case a strike to kill the survivors of an earlier strike, was done without either congressional approval or going through the legal procedures and niceties. More seriously, in more recent months, the last couple of weeks actually or so, the US Navy has been interdicting oil tankers coming out of Venezuela, out of Maracaibo, the major oil-producing part of Venezuela, and seizing them. And so essentially there's been a blockade of oil exports from Venezuela. A blockade, of course, being technically an act of war, according to most standard international relations models.
So what does this sort of tell us about the sort of state of the international order as we see it today? There's lots of talk about, the international rules-based order having collapsed. Did it ever really exist? What's your interpretation?
I think that the international rules-based order, to the extent that there ever was such a thing, has basically bitten the dust. And what does that mean? Well, if you live in the global south, if you are a person from Africa or Latin America, particularly, or large parts of Asia, then you will be rather grimly amused and cynically amused, I think, by the kind of anguished hand-wringing that's going on in Europe and elsewhere about the United States having violated international law and undermined the rules-based order. Because the obvious response is, where have you been for the last 75 years? The United States, either directly or indirectly through proxies, has been intervening in other countries' internal affairs and getting up to all kinds of mischief for a very long time. In Latin America, for well over 100 years, in fact, ever since the late 19th century. So this is not new. That said, though, this is genuinely a major shift, because what we have had since 1945, and certainly since 1990, is an international system which purports to be governed by rules, a kind of international law, a series of treaties between sovereign powers. And this has been underwritten by the power of the United States. The United States, as the de facto global hegemon since 1990 and the major power from 1945 until then, has basically underwritten and supported this system of rules. Now, it has violated those rules when it has been in its own national interest to do so repeatedly, but even then, when it did so, when, for example, it intervened in Libya under Barack Obama or bombed Serbia under Bill Clinton, it did so under the at least pretense that it was doing so in accordance with a system of international law. Now, if you like, the mask has been ripped off and we are basically back in the world of Machtpolitik, as the Germans used to call it, the world where might is right, or to quote Thucydides, the world where the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. So we have had an institution which in one sense was always, if you like, very partial in as much as it did, this system of international law did not bind all players equally, but now even that, I think, has been removed. Now, you may say, oh, this is just Donald Trump. He's not going to be president forever. His health is deteriorating, for one thing. And therefore, this is just an episode in US foreign policy, and it may very well be reversed. I would personally doubt that, because certainly if another Republican succeeds Trump, particularly if it's the vice president, J.D. Vance, we can expect this kind of policy to continue. Even if the Democrats regain the presidency, I think that there would still be a clear move away from the kind of foreign policy and international relations orientation the United States has had, simply because Trump's policy does not simply reflect his own mercurial whims, if you will. It reflects a fairly hard-headed assessment of the actual relative position of the United States in today's world, relative, that is, to the other emerging or actual great powers. And so given that that situation is not going to change, I think that this kind of US unilateralism and abandonment of multilateral rules is going to persist regardless of who the president is.
So the whole idea about international law is a bit of a sort of slightly a strange one to get our head around, because we think about laws on a day-to-day basis in our own country as being enforced by, in a democratic country, they're legislated for by elected politicians and enforced by a police service that you sort of live with in a free liberal democracy. You don't have that sort of police force on an international scale, so it's a bit harder to think about how an international law system works. But as you pointed out, it was sort of underpinned by the superpower of the American. The United States of America. So they pulled back, and we sort of reverted to a bit of a state of nature on the international stage.
This is a standard theory in international relations, which is the argument that the international world, because there is not a global sovereign, much less a global legislator, we are in a Hobbesian state of nature. This is a kind of world in which arguably the logic of Hobbes' states of nature, which is essentially get your retaliation in first, operates. Now, the counter view is the view of people like Hedley Bull and the so-called English school, which is that actually it's in the self-interest of the actors within that world to cooperate and collaborate to create institutions which will restrain everybody in everyone's common interest. In other words, the argument is that the common interest in global peace is sufficiently great that it will override the kind of Hobbesian incentives. The problem with that model and with the whole idea of international law ultimately, though, is that we live in a world of sovereign states, and a sovereign state is by definition without any superior authority. What that means is that participation in a system of international law is ultimately voluntary. If a sovereign state may choose to be bound by international law to subordinate its own choices and actions to a set of rules, which it's only had a small part in constructing, but that's a purely voluntary choice, and a state can choose to ignore that. Now, if the rogue state, as we call it, the one that has chosen to ignore the international conventions and agreements, is a minor power, let's say North Korea, then that doesn't undermine the whole system. But if it's one of the great powers, then it does. And the pretty consistent argument for a long time is that for a system of international rules to actually operate, there has to be either a single hegemon, the British Empire of the 19th century, the American Empire arguably since 1945, or you have to have what you had in 19th century Europe, which is a kind of cartel of great powers, which is presumably the kind of model that the Chinese and the Russians and others would like to see emerge in the aftermath of the United States global hegemony having come to an end. And that could work reasonably well if there's a kind of agreement underneath it between the regional hegemons, the cartel of great powers, as to what their ultimate common interest is. But if they become too competitive, then that system can actually lead, as it did in 1914, to a disastrous outcome. So it's not guaranteed to be any better than the rule of one hegemon, although you might argue that it is in some ways more stable.
How should then classical liberals respond to recent events, but in the broader sense, how should classical liberals be approaching these issues on international politics?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's a question which raises a deeper, more general question of how, if you are a classical liberal, you reconcile your ideal position with acceptance of the world that they're actually in. Which is a constant problem, actually not just for classical liberals, but for people of any political persuasion. You've always got to try and work out, well, if your ideology, your beliefs about the world indicate that the ideal situation is X, but we're clearly not in X, how do you react to and respond to the situation that we're actually in? Now, I think the first thing to say is that classical liberals should not be supporting or approving of the kind of actions that the Trump administration has undertaken under any circumstances. Right now, the policymakers and commentators in DC and elsewhere seem to be channeling Marvel or DC supervillains from the kind of rhetoric that they're using, which is basically, well, screw you, the strong can do what they will, the weak suffer with the much, we're the strong, so stuff you. That is not the kind of approach or ethical stance that any classical liberal, or for that matter, anybody from a conservative, a Thomist Catholic, or a socialist position is going to adopt. This is straightforward, outright rule of the jungle, basically. It's a case of, whoever has the biggest stick is going to set the rules, and that's completely contrary to any kind of liberal principle or order. So you should not accept this. Now, Thucydides, I quote you Thucydides, the famous line from the Melian dialogue where the Athenians say to the unfortunate Melians, there's only justice between equals. In the world that we actually live in, as you well know, the strong do what they may and the weak suffer what they must. The point about Thucydides' comment is that he actually is setting the scene for the collapse of Athens, because that kind of aggressive, boorish domination, if you will, is actually not going to work out well in the longer run or even the medium term for the great power. It didn't work out well for Athens, and the kind of hubris and arrogance behind it led them to the disastrous Sicilian expedition and the loss of the war against Sparta. So, first of all, you can say this is actually bad news for the United States, ultimately. Also, that approach and that whole approach to politics is incompatible, ultimately, with the Constitution and principles of the United States, a point that was made forcibly by 19th century American libertarians when people like Theodore Roosevelt were pushing for American imperialism in places like the Philippines and elsewhere in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War. So this is not a novel question. So that's the first point to make, really. This is actually ultimately no good for anyone carrying on in this way. And classical liberals should not endorse it at all. However, there are some people who would say, well, we shouldn't endorse it, but nothing we can do about it. This is just the way the world is. This is the world we live in. We live in a world where international relations is ultimately based on force and power, and this is just revealing that. As I say, the mask has been ripped off. We've now seen what is behind the curtain. It ain't an old man. It's something much less pleasant, but we just got to put up with it. Now, that may be the actual practical reality of the world we're in. And so the practical politics might well be that as classical liberals, what we have to do is to look for ways of mitigating the effects of great power competition. And probably the best bet is to try and aim for something like the 19th century concert of Europe. You probably are better off with a cartel of regional great powers supporting and structuring a global world order, even though a lot of smaller, countries are going to get trampled when the elephant stands, as the old saying has it. Because if the alternative is the capricious rule of an unbounded single hegemon, that's much worse. You really don't want that, as Latin Americans have been able to tell us for a long while. What is pretty clear to me, I think, from not just this, but other things the United States has been doing lately, is that there's a pretty hard-headed evaluation of the United States' relative position in the world today being taking place in Washington. And the American leadership have clearly come to the conclusion that the Americans can no longer maintain global predominance. And in their recent national security document, they explicitly said that this was neither a desirable nor a plausible policy goal for the US to follow. And if you read that document, what the US has clearly basically said is that it's going to make the Western Hemisphere, the two American continents and the Pacific out to Hawaii, perhaps a bit further, its backyard, and it's going to become the dominant power in that area. And the incursion into Venezuela has been justified in those kind of terms. We can do this where we are now because this is our backyard. The implication of that, of course, is that if the Chinese wish to occupy Taiwan, then it's okay because that's their backyard. It also implies, undoubtedly, that if the Russians want to invade Ukraine, then they should be able to do so because that's their backyard. And the whole vision of the world that you have here is one really where you have a cartel, as I say, of regional hegemons. Certainly Russia and China, the US, maybe others like possibly Brazil, possibly India, maybe the European Union, collaborated together. And that is probably better, as I say. However, we should not accept this as the kind of ideal, nor should we settle for it. I think that this liberals should practice the virtue of hope. And the virtue of hope is the belief that the way things are is not inevitable, that things do not simply have to be the way they are, and you don't have to simply take it on the chin and accept it. That doesn't mean you're an optimist. Hope is not the same thing as optimism. Hope is the confident assurance that there is something else is possible other than what we have. Optimism is believing that it's easy to get to, or that we're moving towards something better. So I think classical liberals should be, if you like, hopeful pessimists on this as on other issues. They should look to revive, essentially, the radical traditions of 19th century classical liberalism in both Europe, Britain, and North America. The ideas of people like Richard Cobden, John Bright, Joseph Sturge, Herbert Spencer, William Graham Sumner, Moorfield Story, Edward Atkinson, all the people who opposed imperialism and great power politics on classical liberal grounds in the 19th century, and who argued for a radical free trade policy, if you like, one which created a world where there was what they called a municipalization of the world, a breakup of great powers into much smaller self-governing communities, which would then connect with each other through free exchange and trade. Now, you may say this is a utopian ideal, but as Friedrich Hayek said, there's no way that you can achieve any kind of political ideal without some vision of utopia. It's an essential part of the project, because that utopian vision is what motivates action in the present, and it's only it gives you a yardstick by which you can measure whether or not change is change in the right direction, because to the extent that change brings you closer to that utopian ideal, then you know that it's good change. To the extent that it moves you away from it, you know that it's a deterioration, it's change for the worse. And so I think classical liberals need to rediscover their radicalism on IR, and they certainly need to get out of any kind of idea that they should be either apologizing for or even worse, supporting the kind of policy the Trump administration is following, for that matter, Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin, or even just accepting it as a kind of grim inevitability with this kind of resigned, weary fatalism. That's not what it should be about.
That's all superbly interesting, and agree with most of what you said. Before we wrap up, we're a little over time, but one question specifically about the Venezuela case is that there may be some people out there who think that actually, classical liberals have pointed to Venezuela for quite a long time for being a good example of what goes wrong with socialism and where sort of socialism will inevitably end up. And Nicolas Maduro was not a good person. We could probably allege. So is there an element to which classical liberals should almost welcome this one action into that specific country?
Not at all, and no more than they should have welcomed the overthrow of Slobodan Milosevic following the bombing of Serbia under the Clinton administration. Just because a bad action which has systemically bad implications brings about a good result, you do not therefore justify that action. It's the standard principle that using really bad means to achieve an end which itself is good undermines the benefit that you get from achieving that end. Plus, in terms of the practical politics, if you look at what's going on here, I am 90% sure this was basically an inside job. And that basically what has happened is that a deal has been struck between the United States and other elements in the regime in Venezuela, probably the military, I would imagine. And the deal basically is that they get rid of Maduro, and in return they enter into a deal with the United States about oil and various other factors. So I think that even if you are invested, as I am, very much so, in the restoration of democracy and civil rights in Venezuela, I don't think that this is either the way to do it or likely to bring it about. It's more likely, actually, to consolidate the regime that's already in place there.
Yeah. Well, Steve, that's fascinating. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you too for watching and or listening. As always, do subscribe to us on YouTube and Substack at insider.iea.org.uk. Thanks for joining, and we will see you next time.